Mr. President, I want to join Senator Dorgan in supporting the amendment of Senator Sanders to audit the Federal Reserve. Let me begin with a perspective of what happened with the stock market today. Clearly, someone got it wrong, created a domino effect of one thing falling after another, and before we know it, the stock market was down $1,000 points. Fortunately, it climbed back up before it closed today. But it just reminds us of how volatile, how vulnerable that we are in a world where so many systems are involved with our financial system. It's good that Congress is looking at financial reform. I only regret that we're not dealing with the real causes of our financial crisis. Wall Street is clearly jittery. You could see that from the stock market today. Everyone, I think, is waiting for the dominoes to fall. We see what's happening in Greece, one country that continued to spend more than it was bringing in until it went bankrupt. And now, unfortunately, the American people are on the hook for yet another bailout. Not even a bailout in this country, but billions of American tax dollars are headed for Greece right now. And as other European countries head towards bankruptcy, last year in this Congress, we created another credit line for the International Monetary Fund to be drawn down. The real irony here is we're borrowing the money from countries like China in order to bail out other countries in the world at a time when the United States is carrying $13 trillion of debt today in projections of tens of trillions of more dollars in the future. It's clearly unsustainable. The stock market and investors have a reason to be jittery, and Americans have a reason to be angry. We saw what the failure of large government organizations like Fannie Mae did and how it cost Americans trillions of dollars. People who had been saving and investing all their lives found out almost overnight that the system they counted on and that we were supposed to oversee was not what they thought it was. And suddenly, wealth was gone. But if Fannie Mae could do that much damage to our country, that's small in comparison with what could happen if the Federal Reserve does it wrong. The Constitution gives Congress the responsibility for our monetary policy. Congress years ago delegated that to an independent agency we call the Federal Reserve, but we're still responsible for monetary policy. And if something is done wrong with that policy, all that we've worked for in this country, everyone's savings and investments and everyone's wealth, not only in this country, but because we're the reserve currency for the world, the whole economic system of the world is resting on top of what the Federal Reserve does. And the fact is, while it's our responsibility to oversee monetary policy, we don't know what the Federal Reserve is doing. Keep in mind, we were assured only months before Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac collapsed. And by the way, we bailed them out, or Freddie Mac, for another $10 billion this week. Only months before they collapsed, we were told by Chairman Bernanke at the Federal Reserve and many other economic experts that there was no problem. But there was a problem. The real problem was we didn't know it. And that was a company created by this Congress, and it was our responsibility to oversee it. And we did not carry out our responsibility. We need an independent Federal Reserve. We do not need political manipulation and second guessing of our monetary policy. But we don't need a secret Federal Reserve. We have to know what they're doing if we're going to be responsible for what they're doing. And it's not going to be enough if they do something wrong that we point our finger at them and say it was their fault, because it is our responsibility. For years, the Federal Reserve has been avoiding any kind of audit, any kind of accountability, any kind of transparency. Every time we ask for some kind of disclosure, they're saying we're violating their independence. We're not violating their independence with this bill proposed by Senator Sanders. All we're doing is uncloaking the secrecy that exists within the Federal Reserve. It's important to know what we do know. We know the Federal Reserve has bailed out Bear Stearns, AIG. Taxpayers are stuck holding the failed bets on everything from toxic subprime mortgages to strip malls and hotels. You know, thanks to the bailouts, taxpayers now own stakes in bankrupt Hilton hotels in Malaysia, Russia, and Singapore. I'm not sure that's what the Congress had in mind when they started the Federal Reserve. Federal Reserve owns parts of Civic Opera buildings in Chicago and Crossroads malls in Oklahoma City. You know, I thought it was bad when the Fed was printing money to keep up the government shopping spree, but I never expected they would buy the mall to go shopping in. They say it's over when the fat lady sings. Well, now the Fed has an opera house ready for her to sing in. Americans deserve to know if the Federal Reserve is being honest with the Congress and with the American people. We know what they say behind closed doors doesn't square with what they say publicly. Recently released transcripts show that in 2004, members of the Federal Reserve publicly downplayed specific concerns they discussed internally about the coming housing crisis. They knew we had a problem. At that time, Chairman Alan Greenspan said, if they were to encourage the public to talk about it, and I quote, "It's possible to lose control of a process that only we fully understand." End quote. Meanwhile, they were telling the Congress and the public everything was fine. And by doing that, they cost millions of Americans a lifetime of savings that they're still struggling. Millions of people out of work because of mismanagement by the Federal Reserve. Yet they seem to think that they require no supervision, no accountability, no transparency. We need to end that with this amendment today. Within 30 days of the President signing this legislation, this amendment that's been proposed, the Federal Reserve will have to tell us who got all this bailout money, how much they got, and the reasoning for giving it, and what terms of repayment there are. It's a pretty simple request. True financial reform must include a full audit of the Federal Reserve and a breakup and a wind down of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. But the people who run the government aren't willing to hold the government institutions responsible. And those who really understand what happened in this financial crisis know that the easy money policy of the Federal Reserve, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, buying subprime mortgages and securitizing them and selling them all over the world, were a large part of the meltdown of our financial system. Yet this financial reform bill that we're talking about does not even address the real causes of our financial meltdown. But one thing we can do if we pass this amendment is make sure there's more transparency, more accountability at the Federal Reserve. As I've already mentioned just yesterday, Freddie Mac posted an $8 billion loss, and it's now fully owned by the federal government. So the federal government is clearly mismanaging Freddie Mac, and they asked for another $10 billion bailout from the taxpayers. But this time that doesn't have to go through Congress. President Obama has taken the caps off anything that can go to these bankrupt companies. So just billions of dollars are going to flow from taxpayers directly to these government-owned entities. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae have together lost at least $126.9 billion so far. It's pretty amazing in a time when this country is just overcome with debt. There's no end in sight, and there's no cap at how much taxpayers could bail them out. Yet they're not even mentioned in this financial reform bill. We've heard about greed on Wall Street, but we haven't even addressed the greed within the government and within the government agencies. The Democrat House Financial Services Chairman Barney Frank doesn't think that these government-run institutions are good candidates for reform. He wrote a memo to the White House yesterday saying they were being managed responsibly and aren't doing any further economic damage. Fortunately, Senator McCain has an amendment to address this, and I hope it passes. But if there's one place that the blame can be placed for this financial meltdown, it comes back to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Wall Street certainly deserves a lot of the blame for the financial crisis because they took advantage of a lot of the mismanagement in government to their own benefit. But the Federal Reserve, Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae also deserve a lot of the blame, and they should be addressed as well. The Sanders Amendment at least begins the process in letting us know what the Federal Reserve is doing. The Audit the Fed Amendment has more than 300 co-sponsors in the House and 32 in the Senate. It's supported by a broad spectrum of political groups, from Freedom Works all the way to very liberal groups. And within here, if America wants bipartisan activity, it could not be more bipartisan than Bernie Sanders and Jim DeMint. So I encourage my colleagues to support this bill. Let's reform not only the financial system, but our own house, and that includes the Federal Reserve. And I thank you, Mr. President. I yield back.